Littleton.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining the second panel of the Brave New Cyber World Conference here at Carnegie. The prior discussion is a good setup, I think, for our panel on active cyber defense. As much as the conversation tends naturally to orient itself towards state-level challenges, much of the strategic action, it seems to me, is happening in the private sector. There are big unanswered questions out there in this regard. What effect will years and years of massive intellectual property theft have on America's economy? What are the costs of the erosion of public faith in the government that results from extremely low rates of successful prosecution of hacking? The answers to those strategic questions depend, it seems to me, more and more on how active cyber defense is deployed and developed by private companies. And that is indeed the subject of our panel. We're fortunate to have with us today an esteemed group to lay out the problem, explain why it matters, and most important, suggest some ways forward. Stuart Baker, to my left, is of Steptoe and Johnson, very well known in this area and formerly of DHS and NSA. Shane Huntley joins us from Google, Google's threat analysis group, formerly with the Australian government, and George Perkovich at the far end from Carnegie, formerly a policy advisor to Joe Biden. So let's just dive right in. Why don't we level set a little bit by establishing what the problem here is that active cyber defense is trying to solve. How big a problem is it? I've seen dollar estimates of hundreds of billions of dollars a year. What is the size of the problem? Who wants to take a first crack at it? Shane, maybe?
Well, so the cyber problem is becoming one of the critical problems to our business. That as more and more business goes online, as more and more of the economy is tied up here, the faith in the systems, the kind of damage that can be caused, we really see this as existential threats to the company and to companies in general, but also just the faith in our institutions and in terms of and companies actually is a competitive advantage or part of our economy going competitive overseas. Like, how does Europe see the security of their data if they're entrusting it to an Amazon or a Facebook or a Google? And how does the consumer feel about doing business going forward? And how much of our resources need to be spent to actually defend this data and to defend our users? I think at the moment we've seen just talked in the last panel, like Sony, a CEO being fired. We've seen the Yahoo hack and what's been going on in government. That these really are issues that are getting to the top of organizations. They're getting to existential threats to the company. So it's pretty hard to sort of put a dollar value on it, but it's the reason why we are taking it very seriously.
And all the trends are down. The attack surface keeps getting bigger. The consequences of successful attacks are worse. Now you can kill people if they have defibrillators that have been implanted. So all of the security trends, with maybe a couple of exceptions, are in the wrong direction, and we need to do something pretty dramatic to turn things around.
Okay, so the answer in large part, we'll get to the absence of government response. Well, no, let's do that right now. So isn't this a problem for government to solve, and why isn't it getting solved? We have the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, but that's not getting the job done. You want to explain what the problem is?
Yeah, I think the short answer is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which says you should stay inside your network and cower there. Is a sort of 1980s solution. That's when the CFAA was first adopted. And it rests on the principle that the government can solve this problem, that if you leave it to the professionals will find a way to deter criminal behavior.
And the sort of the architecture of it is anything you do outside your network on somebody else's network is potentially a crime.
It is presumptively a felony. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, and so that leaves companies with limited opportunities to defend themselves because they basically have to wait for someone to come in, break in, do something, and then even then, it's difficult for them to strike back. So why don't we tackle then what the range of things that companies are doing with that constraint and how they're sort of pushing the boundaries. George?
Well, I want to just pick up on and elaborate a little bit on this question, and Shane's probably in a better position to talk about than the range of things that companies can do. But I think it's first of all, we're talking about the U.S. here, and the problem is global. So whatever we kind of get right or don't get right here, then you have to see how it relates to what others are doing. But I think what Stuart said is very important. Okay, government can solve this problem, but from the standpoint of companies and customers and the system at large, it's even, in a sense, worse than that, because in a way the government can't defend everything. They have to prioritize, and they do reasonably. And so they're going to prioritize systemic government systems, infrastructure, military. So they're not going to do everything. But then
they clearly have their hands full with that.
But then they also can't say, we'll tell you if we think you're going to be attacked, company X. So can't defend you, but they may not notify you. If you are attacked, they can't promise that they will prosecute or go after the bad guys.
The rates of successful prosecution are infinitesimally
As we
small.
talked in the last panel, the government hasn't set standards for security and hygiene. So if you're a company and you're willing to spend money to have the highest standards, but your competitors don't, they may get a cost advantage. And so the state hasn't kind of stepped, at least the U.S. hasn't stepped in and done that. And they won't indemnify you or kind of work on the insurance problem. So in that sense, and I've talked to French and other officials who say, no, that the state absolutely must have a monopoly here, which reflects different cultural differences. And they say this is the function of statehood, it's kind of legitimate monopoly on the use of force or its analogs. And I think the response to that in part is, right, but that idea was based on a social contract where the state provided security. And so you let the state do that because it was better than anarchy, and the state could do it. But what we've been describing in the last panel and here is when the social contract's kind of broken down or never really fully extended to this new domain. And so the state doesn't do that, and so what is the individual or the entity left to do? I think that's the space we're in. And the last thing I would say is, if you can understand the problem that way and then start thinking of, it also could be very, very dangerous to have lots of people out running into other people's networks and everything else. So you've got to find some way to do it right to compensate for the breakdown that we've experienced.
So let's talk a little bit about exactly how the companies are responding to that very crippling set of problems. On the one hand, they're vulnerable. On the other hand, there's extraordinary limits placed on what they can do. That erodes trust, and as Shane said at the beginning, presents existential threats for the companies. So, but there is, in fact, as a result of that, a very robust set of measures that companies are taking, ranging from more aggressive measures inside their own networks, but also offshoring of even more aggressive things that could be illegal here in the U.S. Shane, can you describe a little bit of that?
Yeah.
What's the spectrum of active cyber defense?
So this active cyber defense term is kind of thrown around. It's appearing in a lot of marketing brochures at the moment. And, it's used to cover everything in some definitions, everything from running a simple honeypot inside your organization or just having something to like catch an attacker, all the way
being
through
something where you're basically trying to draw attackers away from the stuff you actually care about.
All the way through to the far extreme of gloves off, the kind of commercial entities have an active hacking campaign and are going at it with the adversaries trying to steal data.
Yeah.
And the reality is that I'm not proposing that everybody be kind of given gloves off, everybody at it, because there's enough hacking in this world without, unleashing the forces of hell of every well-meaning security researcher. But at the moment, we're in the worst possible world with CFAA. As you pointed out, it's incredibly broad. So almost any activity can be kind of covered under it, even from not obeying the terms of service that you haven't read on a website, you can be potentially breaching the CFAA, as we saw with Aaron Swartz, who tragically committed suicide.
Even more fun, you may have seen that Burger King has a commercial that begins, "Okay, Google, what is a Whopper burger?" Which leads your phone to start reading the first sentence of the Wikipedia entry for the Whopper burger. And there was the hacking and counter-hacking campaign in which Burger King tried to make sure that its ad actually did turn on your phone, and then Google tried to make sure that it didn't. But the most interesting question was, did Burger King violate the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act by engaging in unauthorized access to all of our phones? And there's a very good argument that they did, which tells us something very bad about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act.
And I'll just jump in one second here to make sure that the other side of the argument is represented, to say that just as there is a danger, a real strategic long-term danger of lack of faith from businesses and citizens in government if the government is no longer fulfilling its side of the bargain and providing security in exchange for its monopoly on force, there is equally the potential for lack of faith in society and social compact with our fellow citizens if companies get to run around and do whatever they want to whomever they want in the absence of consensus on how we should behave. So establishing norms for how to do all of this is critically important, and I think we're going to get to that a little later in the conversation. We've done so I think we've got basically the range. There's a lot of stuff in between honeypot and destroying hackers' computers, and we can get to some of that, but that does get to sort of the possibility of some flexibility and some gray area where things can be.
And I can give an example of a very specific gray area that, if an attacker has a website which is delivering exploits and then is sort of storing the results in an open way. You don't even need to log into this website. They are not a particularly good attacker. They're leaving the data there in the open. If a security researcher that then goes and visits that website to actually pull the log or pull the data or pull details of the exploit, this seems like pretty normal research. It's like the open internet or whatever, but it's an incredibly.
But that nominally is a violation of CFAA.
It nominally could be, depending on what law you ask.
Right.
We are in a situation now that a company or a good actor that really wants to stick by the law, really wants to understand and do the right thing, is in a situation that all normal actions could potentially be a breach if some prosecutor wanted to go after.
I'm not a lawyer, but this is a fun little area because I spoke with pointed out that even as we're at this advanced edge of technology, somehow it's bringing us back to some very early common law concepts like hot pursuit. Is that a valid justification for going and chasing and collecting the kind of, or there's some other ones. But anyway, it's sort of an odd quirk of this that we're going back to sort of root basic common law ideas in search of some grounding on this.
Can I just to add just where you were and to add on it, and however U.S. were to sort it out, and so we're talking about law now, we're talking about Congress, so it becomes a little hard to imagine actually sorting this out in a coherent way. The rest of the world has an absolute stake in it, because you're talking about companies which are totally global companies, so it adds to the complication. So it's not just like, can I chase the kid who breaks into my house and steals my TV down the street? People in India are watching and paying attention to this, and they have a certain view of kind of U.S. culture and what the predilection is going to be. And for example, I've talked to an Indian official who says, "Whoa, I've served in your country. I know what your gun control laws are. I know about all of the mass murderers with these automatic weapons and stuff. And that's what you're going to unleash in the cyber world. And we're the ones that are going to get killed in the process. So however we do it, you have to think of it as actually a global response as well, to build on your point."
Fascinating and terribly complicated. Reaching consensus. Now, it does...
I will say we unfortunately have exported the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act to most of Europe and a large part of the developed world. with the Budapest Convention. It is slightly more flexible because it prohibits you from taking action without right, and there's a lot of room in whether your action is without right. I think you could say if I'm chasing my stuff onto a public website, I'm doing it with right because it's my stuff. But under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, that would not be with authorization.
So in the absence of government solutions, there's amendments to the CFAA proposed every now and then. There's always I've never gone to an event with someone who does cyber in government without them saying how important public-private cooperation is. But absent some leadership or movement on the government side, it's sort of surprising to me in looking at it that there hasn't been more private sector organization to try and solve the problem. I mean, other problems that business has faced, that government has failed to face, have been resolved through collaborative action. What's the impediment to the private sector? Are they just, lost, or is there a profit reason?
I think one of the problems is
clearly
a
a question for
raise.
Shane.
Yeah, I'd say let's say. We have so many problems in cybersecurity at the moment as an industry. Like, there's this critical shortage of talent. The government has even more talent, but even with industry, I mean, I do pretty well at Google in terms of who I can hire, but there's just not enough people to do the basic defenses. So I do want to put on the record that I don't think that the lack of active cyber defense is the biggest challenge. It probably doesn't even possibly make the top 10 challenges we face in securing our systems today. We have to get back to the basics of building secure systems, being able to defend our systems, being able to detect attackers, being able to recover from attack. And the active cyber defense part is, a small part of this puzzle. So I think that's one of the main issues.
Very much the public policy side of the puzzle, but as you say, right, there's lots that private industry can do.
Can I challenge that? Because I think continuing to build our defenses, build better defenses, doesn't feel like a strategic response to the problem we're in. As the attack surface continues to expand, we're just never going to be able to defend our doorbells the way we defend our servers, and we're not defending our servers that well. And the one area where the technology is moving in a direction that is productive of peace in cyberspace is the ability to attribute attacks more effectively. We're getting much better at that, and we're getting better at it for the same reason that attackers are better. It's harder and harder to hide in cyberspace. It's harder and harder to keep people out of your systems, and we can get into their systems and figure out who they are, and then I'll cause them to suffer consequences for their acts. That's how we police the world, so it shouldn't be a surprise that might work in cyberspace. And if that's the approach, rather than just building our defenses, then we want as many people tracking the attackers as possible. And to say to our private sector, you can only track them based on what they do inside your network is, I think, a strategic limitation that we'll regret.
But yeah, no. I mean, I think it really, really matters how you do it, and we have to, something we're working on at Carnegie, develop the principles of conduct for that action. Because I'm thinking about just over the last few months, and also the San Bernardino shooting, how kind of the online world figures out who did the crime, and almost always it's wrong, shortly. But you can, I mean, that's why we have entities that get legitimacy, whether it's the IAEA or the others in the nuclear domain. So to the question, to put a constructive twist on your point, Stuart, it seems to me, is attribution's growing. So one of the questions is, how does the U.S. and the international community develop kind of internationally legitimated ways to mobilize that attribution, including by private actors, to be able to do this so you don't get the wrong guy and create a really destabilizing situation.
That's obviously a very, very complicated thing, and given how the government has not led, are there ways that private industry can begin to lead on this?
So I challenge the idea that the government has not led. They haven't monopolized this, but the attribution of the Sony attack to North Korea was based on some pretty good intelligence collection, which has never been fully disclosed. But there have been stories about GCHQ attributing certain Russian attacks because they turned on the cameras in the Russian operating center so that they could watch the Russians as they were coming and going and launching particular attacks. So those are things that I don't think the private sector is going to be doing soon. On the other hand, Mandiant, what we know about the Chinese attack infrastructure, we know not because the government told us, because they were afraid to reveal their sources and methods, but because Mandiant caught them and ended up, exposing their blogs and their girlfriends' pictures and a whole host of information about them that they were able to get acting more or less within the law. So there's room for both to operate here. I do think we ought to try to pivot because I think this is the hard question, and at the end of the day, the question we probably all want to get to, which is how do you control what the private sector does? Are you going to say, yeah, whatever, or are you going to try to regulate that in some fashion? And I think it's obvious that you have to regulate it in some fashion. And then the question becomes, what's your model? Do you want to use it like the private investigator model? Do you want to use it like repo men? Do you want to do letters of marque? Certainly people are attracted to that. Yeah, I think this can be regulated in a wide variety of ways that are familiar to people who follow private supplementation of law enforcement, and that's where I would start.
Well, so are you suggesting that the government should impose penalties for not participating in those, or are they incentivizing insurance schemes, or how do you get this set up? Do you have?
I would say the way to start, and this is something that the Justice Department in the last administration actually was surprisingly soft on. They're not going to propose it, but they were not prepared to oppose it either, which is you ought to be able to go to the Justice Department and say, you've got this big statute that could mean anything, and because you wrote it that way so you could prosecute bad people doing bad things with computers, and now we don't think we're bad people. What we want to do isn't bad. Will you tell us you won't prosecute us if we do the things that we say? This is called a no-action letter. The SEC, which has an enormously vague statute saying don't do bad things on stock exchanges, has exactly this. You go in and you say, I don't think this is bad. Will you prosecute me if I do this? And they say, as long as you do exactly what you said, we won't prosecute you. Well, that gives certainty to people and allows them to experiment with things that are obvious and useful without just blowing the doors off.
Let me ask, a lot of the motivation in adopting some of these norms of behavior, some of it comes from government encouragement, some of it comes from financial motivation. What is the state of the insurance industry with regard to cybersecurity? Are companies able to buy insurance to protect their assets? Is that a functioning market thing?
I'd say not yet. I think there's amazing interest in it. There's spoken with these insurance companies, tried to educate them in some cases, but at the moment, nobody's really tested, as far as I know, this sort of liability of what the liability would be in these cases, and if so, what is an appropriate premium, and who's willing to underwrite it.
Right. And
then there's also the other risks that insurance company might be able to protect against these financial risks, but especially for the larger companies, it's not actually being sued for a couple of $1 million, which is the real risk here. It's the reputation risk and the other risks that insurance doesn't really cover for us.
Got it. George,
Bill, we in the work that we're doing, and my colleagues Eli Levite and Wyatt Hoffman, Eli's in Israel, Wyatt's in the UK, we'll be putting out a paper in the next month or so. That's a couple of years of work on this. Been working a lot with some innovators in the insurance industry, and it's as Shane said, although they're making progress and they're motivated. So lots of insurers are writing policies on kind of protecting companies against cyber loss, but with very as Jane made a kind of a joke about yesterday, with very little data or data that they're not that comfortable about. So when you talk to some of them, they say, that company's they're just throwing darts at a wall. They're guessing and writing policies. But the good news from the insurance company is, the holder of the policy doesn't have any idea whether they're actually going to get paid either. Because how do you characterize the threat and the actor that did the theft within a policy will be an open issue. So from the standpoint of insurers and the people we're working with, they have multiple interests in this issue. On the one hand, it's if companies are engaging in stronger self-defense in addition to all of the other modes of defense, will that reduce exposure to loss because they're actually harder to target? So there's a real interest in insurers to do that. The related issue is, in the act of defending itself, will I create new exposure to risk?
If you're taking the gloves off and going
right, and so the insurance companies are looking at there can be a real positive side to this, and we want to figure out how to understand what kinds of defense would be the least likely to cause risk that would be a problem for insurance. And so they've been working with us in developing kind of principles of conduct that we're talking about. And one of the analogies is to what happened with shipping off the coast of Somalia. Remember when all the piracy was going on, and we sent task force of navies out there, and they couldn't stop it. It was too big an area and too complicated. And finally, what happened after a lot of resistance was companies began putting private contractors, in many cases with guns, on ships. And that caused a lot of countries to be very nervous and apprehensive about it. But then the insurance industry got into it and said, actually, we're noticing that the hijackings are going down, our losses are going down, but we got other exposure if you kill the wrong people. So the insurance company started driving kind of self-regulation by the industry, and now
norms of behavior for these private contractors and so on. So are there natural international bodies or international commerce groups where one would look for guidance at setting norms of behavior? In ACD, we should do attribution, but we shouldn't do flaming other people's servers. What are the potential business consortiums that could start a discussion about solutions?
This is easier than that. I wouldn't search for an international solution. I think at the start, the U.S. government, if they're going to let people do this, if they're going to give them leeway under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, ought to say, and if you harm someone, you pay for it. You're just strictly liable. Because we want to discourage, especially at the outset, people doing crazy cowboy things. And knowing that they're going to pay for any damage they do is going to make them very cautious, which is exactly how we want this kind of thing to begin. You don't need a lot of rules on that. You just say you pay.
Is that right, though? I mean, in the process of hunting someone down, can't you cause damage?
Yeah, you can, and you pay for it. I mean, we're not going to turn off. Everyone wants to say, oh, you're going to end up turning off computers in the intensive care unit in some hospital. But those, highly unlikely that you're going to turn off any computers in an effort to find out who's attacking you or what's happened to your data. You're going to be tracking, you're going to be reading logs, you're going to be pulling data that has already been encrypted. Those are things that are highly unlikely to cause damage, and you want people to only do.
Let me ask the person on stage who knows exactly what's being done, what he thinks about it. Shane, how much do you think that this can be solved simply by one or two clarifying edicts from government? And are you worried about what companies are already doing?
I'm a little worried about the cowboys out there at the moment. That, as someone who, we run so much of the infrastructure now, infrastructure that, can be implicated falsely in attacks or whatever, suddenly having every security researcher believing they can break into Gmail or into our servers is something which is of great concern to us. And we see security researchers already stepping outside the bounds in terms of trying to meet their goals.
Can I just ask, hold on, can I ask, you're worried about people coming in and I mean, your business is based on trust to some degree. Are you doing anything that would cause you to be concerned when in the other direction, when you need to chase someone down, are you doing some of that?
To a certain degree, as we said, like with the CFAA, like almost any action we do, and I run Google's threat intelligence team, almost any action, it's very hard to read exactly what the situation is. And it involves many, many meetings with lawyers all the time, and even with very good lawyers, very unclear answers. So I think some clarification could go a long way here.
Are you, just to Stuart's point about collaboration and that it should be easy, say, just to take his example of attribution, are you actively working with governments in the US, around the world, in helping them attribute?
Where appropriate, yes. And we do refer things to the FBI, especially with regards to crime and other cases. And I think that's actually a point that, we could go very gung-ho here. We do actually have governments that do have mandates, and we have mandates that are actually working, right? We actually have, Title 41, so the FBI is involved in botnet takedowns, and there actually are mechanisms that are working just in the recent weeks where partnerships with organizations such as CrowdStrike or Shadow Server, where a combination between, government and legal authorities and private industry with the technical know-how are able to, redirect these botnets of many, many compromised machines to cause them to be redirected and shut down.
I did see the new Senior Director for Homeland Security say publicly that Google could, I'm not sure he named Google, but it was clear he was talking about you, could, if it wanted to, just shut down botnets. Is that accurate?
It's a very simplification.
You're a powerful man.
I would not.
And called on you to do it. I think he did.
Yeah, well, I think we are involved in many things. And to say, look, the private industry has led the way, right? Nobody really called out Chinese government hacking until 2010 when Google stepped up and did, the first attribution really, which everybody in the know knew, everybody in government knew that there was Chinese government hacking. But, Google stepped up and did it. We did again in 2011 when we pointed out that people's Gmail accounts were being broken into from Jinan, China. Mandiant has stepped up. It's been very late with the recent, naming of the Russian GRU very later. In many ways, the problem at the moment isn't the fact that this attribution doesn't exist, so we don't have the powers to learn the attribution, both in government. It's that there's not the bravery to actually step forward and make the attribution. The government institutions especially, they have all these attributions. They know what is going on, and they're not sharing this data even, in closed doors with people like me, but all openly about what's going on. And that's something we need to get beyond, and need to get beyond this classified world of the fact that China does hacking is considered top secret or whatever. It's a joke. So we need to work into a way that actually allows collaboration.
Perfect.
Could I just ask?
Yes, please.
The kinds of cowboy activity you see, are you these people who are subject to the CFAA and are ignoring it, or are these people whose business model is I'm not subject to the CFAA, so I can get away with it?
That's a good question.
I think it's a range. I think the security companies have worked out that the chances of them being prosecuted doing legitimate security research is close to minimal, and so the risk for them is actually pretty low. Even if they produce reports that, if you read the security report, it's pretty obvious that they
yes.
you can say they broke into the server to get this data. You can read the security report they're writing on the actor, and they know they're not going to be prosecuted for that. Right. And then you've also got everything down to the individual security researchers or just gung ho employees, helping that new security hire I have of just turned 22 graduate or whatever. Are we expecting them all to be an expert in exactly where the line is?
All of which gets to the original point, which is none of this is building faith in the sustainability of the compact between the government and the government. That we have a viable trade going on over their monopoly of power and our willingness to give it to them. But let's open up for questions from the room. Just to remind you, you're familiar because you were here before. There are microphones. Wait, identify yourself. And yes, right here in the check shirt.
Hi, good morning. My name is Chris Jikran. I'm with the Congressional Research Service. We spent a lot of time talking about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. To change it a little bit to another law, during the 114th Congress, the Congress passed the Cybersecurity Act in 2015, which authorized the use of defensive measures. I was wondering what your take on the application of any form of active defense through the authorization in that law. Are you risk averse to it? Has it just not been tried? Do people even know about it? So particularly for Mr. Baker, but also to the rest of the panelists as well.
So by and large, the Computer Security Act doesn't open up much room. There's a little bit of room for ISPs to do a little bit on things of active defense on with respect to things crossing their network. And beyond that, the law is very clear in saying we're not authorizing action outside of your network. And I guess I should devote 1 minute to the really pernicious role that privacy groups have played in this debate, because they have finally found someone they trust less than government, which is you. And so they have taken it on themselves to say, this is all vigilantism. It cannot stand. They are principal defenders of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which they are happy to criticize in almost every other context. I don't quite understand why they took that position, but they lobbied very heavily to make sure that the Cybersecurity Act did nothing to authorize and arguably to a little bit restrain this kind of action outside of your network.
Well, I'll just speak up in defense of the privacy organizations who aren't here and say that there is, I think, a legitimate ongoing concern that somebody speak in favor of personal privacy, not just from government, but given the kind of shocking information that we've seen come out of the FTC about the extent of surveillance of individuals by corporations. You know, the FTC estimated that every family in America has a file on it with some amount of data that is used in advertising and so on. So privacy concerns also with regard to corporations are not entirely frivolous. Yes, here with the glasses in the third row.
So Colin Anderson, I see that there's almost two different separate conversations that are going on. One is, Stuart, your argument is to a certain extent punitive, that these letters of marque exist for the purpose of retaliation that might deter further aggression, whereas Shane's argument is in certain respect responsive, it's defensive in the interest of tracking and remediation. I think that we've seen, especially towards the former argument, that doxing Chinese and Iranian actors has not really created a deterrent in sustained campaigns. I'm interested specifically, Shane, your thoughts as sort of a practitioner within a private sector, the supposed beneficiary. I can anticipate these sort of offensive actions can lead to short-term ends, such as aggressive takedowns or disruptions of botnets. Do you think in the long term that punitive actions, disclosure of identities, for example, can meaningfully impact operations conducted against Google, or is it really just sort of continued remediation mechanisms that you're arguing for, rather than being able to, for example, say that you can disrupt these actors entirely?
I think that's an excellent question in the fact that we do need to get beyond. It's like the biggest question I have as a threat intelligence person is, so what if you know exactly who's doing the attacker? What do you do with that information? And I think that is one of the points where this sort of community in both government and the private sector needs to think about is like, what mechanisms do we actually have to change behavior? And people have been experimenting with this, right? Like going back to naming China with regards to the Google hack, that was an experiment, and it actually changed, certain cyber norms. So did the Management Report. But we have to draw these lines about what we actually expect as an outcome, what pressure we're willing to place. And we have this debate at the moment. What are we willing to actually take against Russia with regards to the election interference? What actions were we willing to take against China or cyber criminals stealing our intellectual property? If there's no consequence to the actions, then we can't expect there to be any behavior changes. With regards to naming and shaming, there's different thoughts on this. That should we be, calling out the individual, Chinese private, which is actually undertaking intelligence operations, and arresting them, exposing them, and along those lines. I've always thought that we do have to be very careful with this because, we have, young, American privates also, which are operating for our national intelligence services and other places. Do we
part
want
of our
them
personnel retention policy?
And as someone who worked in government too, right? Do I want to do we want anyone who ends up working for the NSA or the FBI is no longer able to leave the country because they're going to be arrested on sight when they step outside the United States? So we need to draw this boundary between, when do we start going after individuals, when do we start going after the organizations, and when do we start going off the real people, sponsoring this activity? And again, there has to be some consequence, whether it's diplomatic, whether it's financial. Otherwise, if there's no cost and all benefit, then the activity is just going to continue.
And if I could just clarify, it is true. I believe that in the long run, punitive action is what human society is based on. It's how we enforce our norms. We have a reward center in our brain that leads people, men in particular, to harm themselves in pursuit of enforcement of a social norm. We actually get a reward out of that kind of altruistic, punitive behavior. That didn't happen by accident. It's because it's good for the species in some way. So we do have to do that. But I am not arguing that that is something that we should be asking companies to do. That's what the role of government is. And the idea that it is not effective, I think, runs counter to what we've seen with respect to PLA behavior since the U.S. government indicted, in a very embarrassing disclosure, of those PLA members. It was profoundly embarrassing, and it seems to have changed behavior.
All right, just to offer a brief alternative to that dark view of humanity, I would say that what has produced results in the Chinese case is establishment of norms, agreement that it's in the collective benefit, that there are shared interests, and so in support of George's ideas proposed earlier, there may be some less, nasty, brutish, and short alternatives to
process. Just real briefly, and picking up on what Shane was saying, there's a process issue because this is again where one of the things we're trying to contribute is, how do you have the opportunity for different companies, given their antitrust issues and so on, and different players in government to have this kind of conversation to figure out what is reasonable, what would be stabilizing behavior, and to have it in a way where you're not held accountable for what you're about to say, but also to do it internationally, which is even further more difficult. But in order to then build confidence, especially when the companies are going to be the most capable to really defend and to defend the cloud, for example, they have global brands. They're everywhere. So they really don't want to be exposed to a backlash that comes from the Indian government and media or Brazil and so on. So you really have a process problem in addressing this issue.
Perfect. Yes, right there.
I'm Mike Nelson at Cloudflare. I do public policy for them here and globally. I was very glad to hear a very broad discussion of all the aspects of cybersecurity. This wasn't just about hacking to get at data. It was about integrity of data. It was about DDoS attacks. But I'm a little concerned that we've really been focused on attacks on corporations, and normally where we focus along with attacks on governments. But more and more we're seeing individuals attacking each other. Just a few hours ago, Vice published a report based on documents they'd gotten from hackers who had gotten information on 130,000 different customers of FlexiSpy and Retina X, which are tools you can use to hack on your spouse's cell phone. And people on this list were clearly buying these tools to go after business partners, romantic partners. It was all individuals on individuals. Where do we draw the line? If companies can hack back, can I hack back if my partner hacks up me? That's a good question.
Stuart,
this leads to a wild west.
No one is suggesting that you ought to be able to hack anybody you think has done you wrong in the country and Western sense of it. This is a question of what you can do in defending your network against attack. I hesitate because it will only increase my reputation in this room to quote the NRA, but
which way are you going to cross?
They say, when seconds count, the police are only minutes away. This is a real problem in this area where the only people who are patrolling for wrong action on the network are your private people, and you want it that way. And so the only people who can respond immediately to an intrusion, who can engage in hot pursuit, are the people on your network who work for you, and you want it that way, but they can't. And so the model of policing that we have from the physical world, where you get a 911 call or a squad car is patrolling in the neighborhood and can respond promptly, does not work in cyberspace. But that's a far cry from saying, yeah, what the hell, just hack everybody. If I had one rule that I would offer for this, is that under no circumstances should anybody be allowed to engage in hacking to protect their intellectual property, trademark, copyrighted products, because we have seen what Hollywood and the recording industry have done with that kind of encouragement. And it wasn't pretty, and it cost them their industry, and couldn't have happened to a nicer bunch of people. And the same is true for hacking people that you think are acting badly against you. No one is arguing for that.
That's right here, blue tie.
Thank you for the great presentation. Simon Lamage, former State Department. I had a question about a third part of the leg, which is the public and the consumer. And I was interested in perhaps a comment from Google and others on how you see the relationship and any interest in educating and informing a public that is somewhat overwhelmed but very high tech and can potentially be involved in making a situation worse. For example, Facebook sent an update a couple days ago with better rules of the road for policing your own behavior. I have to admit that, like a lot of other people, I spent 2 seconds on it, said I'd come back to it, never did. Have you seen initiatives to better partner with a perhaps less than literate public that can also present a seam or a gap as you think about longer term solutions?
I think everyone wants to have a more educated and informed user base in this space. It's like a long-running sort of like catchphrase that the user is the biggest challenge in security. And we have lots of efforts. We have security checkups. We have participate in cyber security awareness weeks, and we just try and get that information out there to allow people to make these like basic hygiene protections. And as was pointed out in the last panel, that's actually where we're going to have a lot of our protections. Like if our users were actually, using security keys, two-step verification, strong passwords, updating their computers, then huge amounts of these attacks would be going away. And same at the corporations level. And I suppose we really just need to work on the messaging and adjusting the messaging. And like one of the messaging that we've been doing is actually pointing out to the users that are specifically the target of state-sponsored threats to actually let them know that they're actually the target of government-backed attackers, and providing them some more specific advice. And I think that's one of the things we're experimenting with, to try and make things real to them and provide something that's much more targeted than generic advice we're giving to all users, because all users are not created equal in regards to the threats they actually face. But on the other side, though, I think the security industry can't just put all the blame on this onto the users. That one, we have to defend all our systems. We need to get better on countering abuse, countering spam, countering fake login systems. That it would be a total cop out if we started to say that all the security problems are because our users aren't smart enough. It's like we have the expertise. There's a lot more we can do, and we can't just expect people to solve the problems themselves.
Yeah, it's like saying we would solve the problem of venereal disease if people would just listen to our abstinence message. It's a great idea, but it's not a solution.
Yes, right there. Oh, no, wait, in the way back. Sorry. There we go. Oh, anybody there?
Oh,
Nobody
okay.
there?
Hi, my name is Hee-Jung Yang from Radio Free Asia. I would like to hear your opinion about, there was actually a report about by former Foreign Secretary of UK, Mr. Rifkin, that North Korea's missile test was sabotaged by U.S. intelligence. What do you think about that idea, and do you think it's plausible?
So I'll just jump in on that one. Previous panel might have been a better one for that, since this is focused on private sector and active cyber defense. I think that David Sanger, who was on that panel, addressed, and some of the other former and current government officials said it was plausible, though not necessarily proven.
I jump in
Yeah,
on this,
please, George.
but
Yeah.
just because it relates somewhat to what we're talking about. In that instance, what North Korea has been doing is in violation of existing UN Security Council resolutions. So it's not like hacking your spouse's phone or any of the other things we're talking about. It's a very special circumstance where there already is, in fact, international kind of obligation on North Korea not to do the thing that was being acted against. Whether or not it was hacked or not, I have no idea.
Fairly well-established norms, international legal norms for that. So yes, sweater vest or no vest.
Hi, Rich Bell. I'm with the State Department's Foreign Service. So you mentioned earlier about a lack of consequences. There's no incentive to change behaviors. With that in mind, how, I guess, would, with the recent disclosures of government hacking, government call an inventory of zero-day exploits, and the need for public-private partnerships to be effective in these areas, I mean, how do you see this affecting the industry and those public-private partnerships, given the claim that they were sharing information, but clearly they're also keeping a stockpile?
I see. So the question is it how do we manage the government's use of zero-day exploits? And I see. Do you feel lack of faith in the government because they have 0 days that can take Google down?
Well, one was approved that I wouldn't say that necessarily they have 0 days that can take Google down. I would not.
I'm doing my best imitation of.
I think obviously we want more defense. Like we're on the defense side of this problem, but we recognize, or I recognize, since I speak for companies, that U.S. spy agencies are going to spy. They're going to have these capabilities, but that actually puts us in a position where our incentives are not aligned with the U.S. government at all times, especially as a global company, especially as a company trying to build trust. We have, especially post Snowden, post all these leaks, the U.S. government brand is massively toxic in this space. And as somebody who's like fighting government threat actors, many of our users believe that the U.S. government is probably the biggest government threat actor they need to worry about. So all these things are in the background when any sort of proposals come forward with regards to like public-private partnerships. In terms of there's also like a power asymmetry between the government and private sector, in terms of the government has these like methods to like impel kind of data disclosure, which also leads to a lack of trust. So I think all these factors add up that working with government is very difficult, and none of these things help. And specifically on the vulnerability equities process, yes, of course, I think it is, it is worrying the amount of exploits that are out there that are being kept, and that there is this equities process, but we're not seeing a lot of disclosure. And the fact that we're seeing that obviously the U.S. government is unable to keep control of the exploits it has over long periods of time, and they're being leaked. Right. And how long were they out there? Like the Shadow Brokers leak, which is the recent leak of exploits, obviously was leaked a long time ago, but it seems they're happy to let it be out in the wild.
Getting back to the original point about how corrosive all of this can be strategically in the long term when you lose faith in the government. So thank you very much to the panel, and thank you all, and welcome Jared to the stage.
Thank you very much to this panel and the last one. You guys can hang out or sit down, doesn't matter. But my name is Jared Cohen. I'm the CEO of Jigsaw at Alphabet Inc. And thanks to Bill and Carnegie and all of you for being so patient to join us today for what I think is a really important discussion, and one that I hope we'll have many more of. As we sort of wrap up, I thought I would just say a few things or make a few points about where all of this is going. And I think before you do that, it's kind of interesting to ask a very obvious but important question, which is why are we talking about this now as opposed to at this level 3 years ago? And I think it's pretty clear that if you look at the last decade and a half, it's really been a story about the advent of technology, right? That is sort of an access revolution, which has brought us to this moment where you have about 4.5 billion people around the world connected to the internet. Of those, about 2.6 billion smartphones are in circulation. But by 2020, you're going to have north of 7 billion smartphones and essentially connectivity in every corner of the globe. It's already happening in really surprising places. I was in the tribal areas of Pakistan in December, and I had better 4G access than I do in East Hampton. So, kind of go figure. But we're basically closing the book on this chapter of history, right, where we were talking about, what happens when technology and access arrives. So you asked the question, what will the next decade look like? And I think it's why we're sort of at this moment where we're trying to make sense of all this, which is the next decade is going to really be defined by the ubiquity of technology and all of the implications that come with that. So, Bill and I have written about this and have had ongoing conversations about it for a long time, but just a few observations about some of the things that happen in a world where technology is ubiquitous. I mean, first, power dynamics shift in all sorts of interesting directions, right? So one of the things touched on today is that there does seem to be this consensus. There's no such thing as cyberspace, right? In a world where technology is ubiquitous, you have one international system, and it has a physical front, and it has a digital front. So the powerful countries are the ones that can project their economic, political, and military influence in a way that's sort of sufficiently hybrid to reflect the new realities of the world. And you have certain countries like the US and China, that are incumbents that just get even more powerful, right? You have some friendly countries like Israel and Singapore that gain disproportionately. You have countries like Estonia that are able to punch way above their physical weight. You have very adversarial countries like Iran and North Korea, which in a world where technology was not ubiquitous, were declining in influence every single day. And now they've managed to resurrect a significant portion of that influence because of the asymmetric things they're willing to do in the cyber domain. And of course, Russia being the obvious example, is a country that's been able to take analog motivations and use new tools to resurrect a lot of Cold War tactics that people are quite familiar with. But it's hard to talk about the ubiquity of technology without talking about data. And ultimately, data is going to be a huge determinant of which countries are up and which countries are down. And it's not just the volume of data, it's the ability for a country to make use of that data, it's the ability for that country to protect the data that they have. And to me, data is basically the digital equivalent of oil, right? It's the largest man-made resource the world will ever know. It has a lot of parallels, right? It fuels economies, it shapes geopolitics and influences societies for better and for worse. And if you look at its collection, refinement, and distribution, it involves many of the most expensive and complex man-made systems that the world has ever known. But of course, there's two huge distinctions. That I think will make countries pursue access to data with an even more voracious appetite. The first is you have no geographic barriers of entry, right? 196 countries on Earth can mass produce this, and every single individual in this room or any country is their own kind of metaphorical digital oil well. Second, you don't have the same economic barriers of entry, which kind of speaks for itself. So in a world where you have a bunch of countries pursuing data with a voracious appetite, you also have some of the same negative trends that follow as well. So if we look at the story of oil and natural resources, there's countries like Norway that got it right, and there's a very long list of countries that got it terribly wrong. And we'll see some of this normative asymmetry in terms of what countries do with their data, how they're willing to make use of it, and also how are they willing to weaponize it. And I think one of the most sort of complicated trends that we're going to see in a world where technology is ubiquitous is, we're just living in an era where every war is going to begin as a cyber war, and more often than not, they're not going to spill over into the physical domain. And when I talk about sort of all wars being, cyber war, beginning as cyber wars, you're really talking about wars unfolding silently, invisibly, and relatively inexpensively. And we have to be careful. People talked a lot about taxonomy. We throw these very broad terms around, and these broad terms have very serious implications. And if you think about the asymmetry of which countries have an indigenous or an organic capability to conduct, widespread nefarious cyber activity, there's no reason to believe that the less capable countries, terrorist organizations, or criminal enterprises won't just procure it on the black market or procure it or trade it, in sort of the equivalent of a cyber arms deal for natural resources from some of the more powerful countries. But I think that we need to study what it means to sort of go to war or engage in combat in the cyber domain, because what's unique in this moment is it's the marriage between the traditional, more kinetic attacks, which are the hacks on the systems and infrastructure, with some of the disinformation campaigns, which is really more about hacking the conversation. And there's sort of three categories of these. The first is what happens when cyberbullying becomes better organized, better funded, and state-sponsored. We call this patriotic trolling, right? It's the sort of, it's the equivalent of going after the influencers on the battlefield and removing them from the battlefield, right? This is, Erdogan's government, trolling, female journalists with dozens of rape threats every single minute and so forth. You also have, fake news, which is a story that I think gets, often hyperbolized and everything sort of gets lumped into it. But, to me, fake news is, the digital equivalent of, sort of information operations that, we've known for some time. I think what doesn't get talked enough about is how autocratic regimes use fake news to digitally wag the dog, right? And that's something that we see, quite commonly. But the most important one that doesn't get talked about enough is really these, attempts at networked propaganda campaigns, which are really the digital equivalent of insurgencies. And this is really the sort of manufacturing of digital identities and digital soldiers that look quite real, and their deployment as sort of key influencers in conversations where they blend in and look and feel like the rest of us. And the goal is to influence the conversation online so it changes things offline. So, those are some of the trends that I think we have to be cognizant of as the world sort of enters this ubiquitous technological moment. And then I'll just leave you with, a couple questions to ponder, which is always a nice way to wrap up. The first is we talked throughout the day a lot about deterrence and, proportional response and so forth. And I think there really has to be a doctrinal recalibration that isn't sort of a perfect carryover of how we thought about deterrence and proportional response in the physical domain to the digital side of things. But I think we really need to talk about what will incentivize a change in behavior. And in particular, when we're talking about proportional response, we have to accept the reality where the retaliatory moment, oftentimes because of attribution difficulties, will come many years after the attack happened, at which point the context has changed, the relationships have changed, sometimes even the governments have changed. The second question we have to sort of ponder as we leave here is how should government organize to meet some of these challenges? And this covers everything from how you recruit top talent to how you make sure that you're not orphaning everything cyber, right? To me, there's a real question about, how we integrate cyber into every single thing that we do so that we're tackling these challenges in ways that reflect their hybrid attributes. And then the last question to ponder is, what does this mean for all of you as individuals in this room? As I sort of listen to this panel, it makes no sense to me that we're not more cybersecurity conscious as individuals, right? If I was to stand here and take a sort of, a plastic bag of white powder and just sort of throw it on all of you, and you asked me what it was, and I said, I don't know, but Bill gave it to me outside and said there was a 5% chance that it was a contagious virus. All of you would sort of take turns, punching me in the face, and then you'd all go to the doctor to figure out if I infected you with some kind of virus. And you think about the inconvenience associated with taking care of your physical health, and the fact that we all sort of, we blow up our schedules, we, spend time finding the doctor, we get stuck waiting in the waiting room for the doctor, all these different things, and yet it's so convenient and easy, and it should be seamless to take care of our digital health, and yet none of us do it. I mean, even at companies, it's just annoying to wait for your sort of software to upgrade and so forth. So there has to be a paradigm shift where we start to think about our health as an aggregate of our physical and our digital well-being. And I think that actually is something that has to be an investment at the youngest ages of the people living in our society. So with that, just, I'd really, again, like to thank you, Bill, and Carnegie and our panels and all of you for being so patient. Let this be the first of many conversations like this. So thank you.